While the world grapples with the crisis that has sprung from the novel COVID-19 virus, the attention from pertinent issues like climate change have taken a backseat. COVID-19 has shown that the world can slow down world travel, reduce carbon footprint, and curb climate change. It turns out that the change in lifestyle and commitment is possible, and that climate change is merely a matter of conviction. The 25th session of the Conference of Parties, which was held in Madrid, Spain in 2019, left activists and scientists no closer to securing a commitment needed to slow down the rate of global warming. On the other hand, there are varying views on the subject to begin with, that climate change is simply climate variation, that it is a natural occurrence and not man-made. Today we're joined by Professor Pius Yanda from the University of Dar, Salaam, a climate change expert who's also the vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Professor Yanda will unpack this complex subject from a Tanzanian, from a regional, and from a global perspective. Professor Yanda, welcome to Uongozi Institute In Focus program, where we'll be deliberating on climate change issues. My name is Ngasuma Kanyeka, and I'm your host.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very exciting program. And I'm definitely excited about it, and I'm sure the discussion will be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Professor Yanda, demystify this for us in very simple language. What is climate change, and why do developed and developing countries need to care about it?
Climate change can simply be described as a change in the average climate conditions, such as temperature, rainfall, in a region over a long time frame. And what we mean here is that we're looking at the changes that have been taking place over time on issues on temperature conditions as well as climate rainfall conditions.
So who are the key players in this crisis, in this climate crisis? And what role do they play in exacerbating the climate change crisis?
I would say that we are all key players with different roles. If we look at it at the international level, we have basically two groups. Those countries which have emitted more greenhouse gases, who are considered to be the major cause of the crisis that we have today. But we have another group of especially the developed countries, which are now suffering most from these climate change impacts. But if you go down to the local level, both at a regional, national and local levels, we also have different roles to play. If we are to talk about responding or addressing climate change issues, the international community has to come up with frameworks on the ways in which we can address these problems. But at the regional level as well, have been working on developing some kind of guidelines on how best we can address these problems. But also, I mean, if we are to talk about Africa, of course, we have our own sort of unique challenges related to climate change. So African Union has also been working very hard to come up with a framework, as well as these regional blocks like East African Community, SADC regions, have also been developing some kind of guiding frameworks on how best we can address this problem. But if we come down to the respective nations, such as Tanzania, for example, the country has also been developing some kind of guiding policies, like a national climate change strategy. We have National Red Plus strategy and action plan. And those are basically guiding sort of policies which actually give us some kind of guidelines on how best we can address these climate change challenges at a national level.
Is it true then that African countries are more vulnerable to the risks and impact of climate change? And if yes, why? And what does that imply for African growth?
Yes, African continent is the most vulnerable continent as far as issues of climate change are concerned. And of course, other continents as well, especially these developing countries, are equally vulnerable, but Africa is considered to be the most vulnerable one. And the reason is that most of the economies of most of the African countries are dependent very much on climate-related kind of activities, of which these are now affected by climate change. But also when it comes to the capacity to respond to the climate change impacts, we have a very low adaptive capacities in the sense that we are not in a position to address the impact of climate change adequately. And of course, for several reasons, one being that we have a low economies, but also we're also confronted with other equally important stress factors like poverty, health-related problems, diseases, and therefore climate change becomes more of an added stress factor, for the human well-being. So implications now is that climate change basically is even retarding, even the achievements, the economic achievements that we have, attained for a very long time. But also it's now even making us unable to attain even the development, sustainable development goals, simply because it's actually compromising the economic, base of these developing countries like African continent.
So it seems to be a global crisis, yet it requires local initiatives. So what are some of these key regional initiatives for adaptation and mitigation? And how are both developed countries as well as African countries enforcing some of these mitigation and adaptation measures? And then maybe another question to add to that as you respond, how are these initiatives financed?
Maybe let me start by just articulating the kind of initiatives that we are referring to. We can look at these initiatives at different levels. At a global level, there are a number of initiatives that we can think of. We have initiatives like issues of mitigation. We call it CDM. There is a RED Plus initiatives. These are the initiatives that are aimed at reducing, emission levels. But also we have adaptation initiatives at international level as well. But then those ones have sort of been customized at different levels, both at a regional and the national levels as well. And the idea is that the countries should be in a position to be able to address these climate challenges based on the situations in that specific country. And now the issue is that most of these initiatives are funded by the international community, and I should mention that there are funds which have been dedicated to support these kind of initiatives. We can talk about Adaptation Fund, we can talk about Global Climate Fund, and of course even GCF. But I think the challenge now is how to access those funds. This has always been a problem, especially for the developing countries. Now at a national level, there are also some other initiatives which are also being customized from the international initiatives. And what we can think of is actually activities like National Adaptation Plan. These are initiatives at a national level. We also have NAPA, National Adaptation Plan of Program of Action. We also now have what we call it nationally determined contributions. This is an initiative which countries have to take up so as to address the issues of climate change at a national level. But much as we have all these initiatives in place, the challenge has always been funding to support those activities. So as I mentioned, is that there are these global funds which provides resources to support these activities. But I think the challenge over time, has been how to access those funds. That has been really a difficult problem, in that the procedures that has to be followed to be able to access those funds has been very complicated, and therefore making it difficult to most of these developing nations to to access the funds.
Professor Yanda, unpack that complexity for me and the audience. What is making it difficult? In the wake of COVID-19, we've seen that there's political will and deliberation for countries to take strict measures to manage the impact of COVID-19. If such political will is able to be expressed when this pandemic is raging in the world, why can't the same political will be used to address climate change issues?
Thank you. I'm glad you have raised this issue. And obviously, the COVID-19 is a very good example on how the entire world actually worked together to see how best this problem can be addressed. And what I can say is that the entire world was in a state of panic because no one knew what would be the solution to the problem. Now, when it comes to climate change, this is an issue that there is, I would say, divided interest. We are talking about the polluters vis-a-vis, the recipient or rather the affected communities. We have these nations which have contributed significantly to the greenhouse gas emissions. And we have the developing countries which are basically the most affected ones, but they have contributed far less. If we take an example of Africa, Africa is contributing to the tune of 3.6% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that our contribution is actually, as a continent, is very minimal. But if you look at the impacts that we're experiencing from the global warming or from the climate change, of which our contribution has been very, very minimal, the impact is very significant. So now, when it comes to solutions, there are divided interests for several reasons. One is political, but the other one is economic. Because when we talk about, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's something touches on economies of the developed world. We have to think of even changing the technology, the production technologies in the industries, so as we cut down the emission levels. But this is also, even when we talk about, for example, stopping using coal. In some countries, the coal industries actually provides, I would say, employments in the tune of several numbers of employees. So stopping coal production, it has implications both from the economic point of view as well as political point of view. So I think this divide makes it difficult to have a common sort of a framework that can actually assist in addressing this problem.
How then do countries such as Tanzania and the African continent strike a balance between growth and economic demands on one hand, and then making sure that that growth does not impede or contribute to climate change?
Yes, and of course, in every development activity, there is always a trade-off. We have to accept that. But I think one point that we have to admit is that so far, as a continent, as a country, our contribution to the emission level is very, very minimal. I would say is almost insignificant. So even if we embark on activities that has, contributes to a certain amount of emission, but still, in the greenhouse gas emission budget, will still be seen as contributing very minimal. But I think what is also important is that much as we know for sure that our contribution is still very minimal, but I think it's important to take sort of a route or a path that we consider to be a path that reduces emission levels. And here we are referring to what we call it, green growth or what we call climate-compatible development pathways. So we can we can still embark on activities that has an effect on emission, but I think we have to try our best to go for the options that actually will sort of lead into less emissions. In other words, we have to choose the technologies which are, I would say, efficient technologies with, less, with the minimal levels of emissions. Otherwise, we cannot say we should not develop because we are afraid of contributing to greenhouse emissions. But I think we have to be mindful that, we take the path that will not actually enhance the greenhouse gas emission levels.
So one of the other things that I've wondered about is the fact that the African continent could potentially be an absorption site for these carbon emissions. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
What I can say is that in the IPCC studies, it was established that deforestation contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is an international scientific body that does climate change assessments regularly, came up with scientific documentation that deforestation contributes significantly to carbon dioxide emissions. In other words, the forest can be seen as a carbon sink. So Tanzania and other African countries and other countries in the tropics like Brazil, DR Congo and Tanzania, this can also be seen as a carbon sink if we manage our forest properly. So in other words, we have this opportunity to save the international community, or rather to save the globe in terms of managing this forest so that the forest can actually absorb the already emitted greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So if we look at that way, yes, that's the function that we can perform.
I'm still going to go to the opportunity conversation, and I want to press back on that finance complexity that you alluded to earlier. Could you tell us a little bit more about what are the kinks in the system that make it difficult for developing countries to access financing? And what could be some of the measures that could be taken to unpack and open this financing so that we can mitigate climate change?
Yeah, what I think the challenge that we see is the procedures in which one has to follow to be able to access the funds, in terms of putting up the proposals, and sometimes it's a multi-stage kind of a proposal development that you go from one stage to the other, and also even the accessing the fund. In some cases, the countries may not access directly; has to go through the intermediary bodies, and of course these are the layers of bureaucracy, and this creates the whole complications, and therefore becoming difficult to access the funds.
Well, certainly climate change seems to be a complex matter for a very complex time. Maybe just to wrap up, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you think could be done. What are some of your recommendations as an expert in this matter?
Well, my recommendation is that climate change is a global phenomenon, but at the same time, in addressing climate change, you have to act locally. In other words, we may wish to see how best we can work with the communities to to come up with ways of addressing climate change impacts at a local level. And I'm bringing up this because for all these years, we have had what we call it climate variability. And the communities at a local level have been maneuvering around that challenge. And to some extent, they have developed certain knowledge on how to deal with the droughts, for example. I think we would take advantage of the local knowledge and see how that can actually be modified or accommodated within the national adaptation frameworks, so that we come up with the actions that are more appropriate and locally developed, And that way, I think you will be able to address that climate change impacts at the local level. We acknowledge that problem is there, but again, we should not just come up with the frameworks that are developed at a national level and impose them at a local level, given the diversity of the ecosystems of our country. So really, each locality has to come up with its very specified sort of actions, which may not be relevant in other locality. So really engaging the communities in coming up with a solution to the problem, this should be seen as a very important issue to think of. And the same applies to developing the policies, because the policies should be informed by the experiences and knowledge from the local communities. And that way, therefore, the policy framework can be relevant, because it has taken on board the key issues from the lower levels. These are the kind of, the contributions that I can make.
Sounds just about right. Act local, think global. Thank you very much, Professor Pius Yanda, for joining us today at In Focus program. It was an absolute pleasure to hear your thoughts and to get an insight into some of your expertise on climate change issues.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very exciting session. I was excited with the guidance you have provided in terms of leading the discussion. And thank you very much.